are here with us. Welcome for those of you that just joined. We are going to go ahead and get started in a minute or two while we're waiting for people to join. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Hope you are having a wonderful afternoon or evening, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Chris Miller. I am chair of the Council on Mental Illness, and we are going to do an opening prayer, and then I will introduce the lovely Laura, who is going to help lead this presentation along with me. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll start in prayer. So hold on a moment. So we are going to pray the Saint Dymphna prayer, which is the patron for those with a mental illness. So in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Lord, we pray for those who have a mental illness. Help us to understand that the way we talk about people with a mental illness affects the people themselves and how we treat the illness. So often, people who have a mental illness are known as their illness. People say that she is bipolar or he is schizophrenic. When we talk about mental illness, we should not use that phrase. People who have cancer are not cancer. Those with heart disease are not heart disease. Let us always remember that people with a mental illness are not the illness. They are beautiful creations of God. There is so much fear, ignorance, and hurtful attitudes that the people who suffer from mental illness needlessly suffer further. Help us to support and be compassionate to those with a mental illness, every bit as much as we support those who suffer from any other illness. Grant courage to those whom we pray and fill them with hope. If it is according to your divine will, grant them the recovery and cure they desire. Help them to remember you love them. They are never alone. Lord, we pray for those who have a mental illness. Saint Dymphna, patron of those with mental illness, pray for us. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks again for joining us. This is the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, our monthly webinar series, and today's focus is on youth suicide. So I am currently serving as chair of the Council on Mental Illness, which is sponsored by the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. And with me is the amazing Laura Lewis, and I'm going to have her introduce herself.
Hi, at least on my end of the country, it's evening. So good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Laura. I am a licensed professional clinical counselor, and I work at Ohio State in suicide prevention. And happy to be joining you tonight to talk about a really important topic.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you joined us. I also wanted to mention if anyone needs captions, they are available. You will see the icon for the individuals that are panelists, and you will see the address, the https://www stream text. The rest of that, and if you go to that site, you will be able to access the transcription. At NCPD, we try to make things accessible as much as possible. So thank you to our transcriber and for everyone for their support. So we're going to start with a brief overview of suicide, particularly with young people. So nationally, suicide sadly is the second leading cause of death for people aged 10 through 34. In the chart in the upper right corner, you can see this is from the CDC, Center for Disease Control. There are 10 leading causes by death by age group, and 2017 is the last year most recent year with complete data. And you will see that suicide is the second highest rate of leading cause of death, second leading cause of death for people aged 10 through 34. Between 1975 and 2016, there were more than 85,000 suicides in youth aged 10 to 19, with 80% in boys and 20% in girls. It's important to note with that boys tend to be those that attempt suicide tend to have higher rates of death because of the means, which is typically through firearm. The rate of suicide peaked in 1993 and has been on the decline until 2007 when they again started to climb. Although boys were 3.8 times more likely than girls to kill themselves over one 40-year study period, the gap is rapidly narrowing. Starting in 2007, the rates of suicide for girls 10 to 14 increased 12.7% per year, compared with 7.1% for boys the same age. A similar trend was seen for teens 15 to 19, with the rates of suicide going up 7.9% for girls and 3.5% for boys. One of the key things here to understand is that boys ages 15 to 19 continue to take their own lives using firearms at far greater rates than girls, but the rates of hanging and suffocation in girls approach those of boys. Finally, the suicide rate at ages 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 years increased since 2017 to its highest point since 2000, with a recent increase, especially in males in ages 15 to 19. So this, needless to say, this is a serious issue, and we can all work together to try to reduce these rates.
So we thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the nuances that we're seeing and the impact that COVID-19 is having on our young people, just from a general mental health perspective, but also specifically from a suicidal ideation perspective. And it's important to note that the data isn't 100% there yet on suicide attempts and completions as it relates to the pandemic, although I think you can anticipate we're going to see that information here coming about a little bit more thoroughly in the next 6 to 8 months. So what we do have to offer are some preliminary data, but also some guesses related to increases in prevalence rates in anxiety and depression, which we know are often comorbid or factors with suicidal ideation. So let's just kind of acknowledge here, from March to June, we did see a jump, most pronounced by our young people. And we know that about 11% have seriously considered suicide in the past month, and that increases considerably, really, for people who are aged 18 to 24. We also know that social distancing has been a really tricky thing for us to navigate, because while we know that it's keeping us safe, it does have the propensity to increase isolation. And so you've probably heard a lot of campaign messaging around what connectedness needs to look and feel like in order to keep those safety guidelines in mind and to protect each other, but also to make sure that we're not pushing people away into spaces that are not healthy for them and trapping them. And so to that end, some of that preliminary data tells us high school students are feeling lonely, 61%, which is very significant and up from what we would consider to be comparative data to this time last year. Anxiety, depression, other challenges, 45% feel more stress. Physical health is being impacted. 25% are losing more sleep. We could throw eating challenges in there as well. Feeling unhappy, low self-confidence, low sense of self-worth. And it's worth noting that a lot of these challenges are more pronounced for young people of color. It's really important for us to keep in mind, because in general, we have different at-risk groups that are of students of color who are more at risk anyway. And the pandemic has exacerbated those symptoms in those situations. We're also aware of the fact that we're, as I mentioned, going to be seeing more information come out on suicide. And especially those of us that are in the mental health field, we are really bracing ourselves for what we think is going to be a peak down the road with a need for help and support long after the pandemic subsides.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for your overview of that. We're going to spend some time now talking about prevention.
So whenever we talk about prevention, we always have to throw in what we would kind of call these philosophical underpinnings, or like the core beliefs that we know about suicide, because one of the things that keeps people from getting help are myths. And so this is really important for us to mention here. And these are things that we would encourage you to continue to share and to translate in your areas of work and the people you serve too. We cannot say that suicide is 100% preventable. Which is a really difficult statement to make, because Chris, myself, everyone would love to be able to sit here tonight and tell you that's the case, but it's just not. And the reason for that is that it is complex. It is not this black and white issue that we like to make it out to be. It's not simple. There's a lot of variables that go into someone's world where they begin to think that that is the best way to ease their pain. But the good news here is that it is preventable, and we know what goes into preventing suicide. And so therein lies the work that we have in front of us to communicate that information, but to also have a hopeful attitude about the fact that we can really impact the societal phenomenon. We also know that the numbers are higher than reported. So all of the numbers that Chris just gave to you are not 100% accurate. Suicide is one of the, in terms of mental health especially, one of the most underreported issues that we deal with. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it primarily relates to stigma and this prevailing idea that to have suicidal thoughts makes you a bad person. It makes it impossible to reach out for help, and it certainly makes it impossible to be rescued from that, which of course is all completely false. So anytime you see statistics, you might as well assume that they're not, they're higher than they are. We also know suicide doesn't discriminate. It does not care about socioeconomic status. It does not care about your money. Actually, anybody can be at risk. And as you'll see in a minute, this is what makes it so complex, is that there are a number of variables that have to come together for someone, both within themselves and in their environment, to create that notion that that would be the best way for them to move through their pain. We do know that certain groups are at higher risk. Some of those groups are our veterans, our LGBTQ plus population, particular minority groups, men. Largely, suicide is a male phenomenon, and there are others as well. We know that protective factors help to reduce risk, which we'll talk about in a minute. That helps to bring forward that notion that this is a preventable thing. And we know that stigma reduction is critical. And it remains the number one reason, again, that people do not seek help, which continually we put above money even and access to resources. And also, lastly, suicide is not this mental health thing that we put into a box. And it might interest you to know that it wasn't until about 1999 that our government acknowledged in the United States that suicide was actually a problem. It wasn't that we weren't losing people, because we have been, but it took us a while to get to the point where we could actually say that this is a public health issue. And in that, it requires a public health type of response, which is in fact what prevention is. So another way we think about it in this business is suicide prevention is everybody's business. Everybody has a role to play. And everybody has a way in which they can personally reach out to people who are in distress.
Thank you, Laura. Great points. So gatekeeper trainings teach people to identify individuals who are showing warning signs of suicide risk and help these individuals get the services they need. But gatekeeper training typically are for individuals, educators, youth ministers, really anyone that is working with young people. So these are some of the examples of gatekeeper trainings. There's on the right there, QPR, question, persuade, refer. It's a wonderful hour to 2 hour training about helping people get the question, ask them, which we'll talk a little bit more about, persuade them to go get help, and helping them to refer to get more professional help. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP, which you will hear a couple times in this presentation, has the More Than Sad gatekeeper training, which is really focusing on taking the shame out of the pain. as well as Cognito, which is a health simulation company that supports trainings, online trainings, avatar-based trainings. And then LivingWorks has a assist program, and there's a couple of other programs that LivingWorks has. Actually, they just in the last 6 to 8 months started LivingWorks Start, which is a new kind of gatekeeper training for individuals without much training on suicide prevention. So these are all things that trainings that you can learn more about by Googling these, and really encourage people to learn how they can be a gatekeeper.
So we wanted to share some important warning signs, and I want to say that not every warning sign is on the slide, but these are the ones that we tend to see the most and the ones that people tend to remember to look for the most. So that's why these particular ones were chosen. But you might see that as you read through them, some of them might feel a bit more obvious and others are not. So we'll talk about this more in a minute, but actually saying that you want to die or that you want to end your life or to kill yourself. Often people are very direct about that. Looking for a way, researching methods, engaging in blogs, chat rooms, and spending a lot of time trying to connect to the concept of death. Feeling hopeless. This is actually really, really important because when people lose hope, we get worried. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, but we want to make sure that people have a reason to live. And when people can't identify that, there is clearly something there that is a barrier to their understanding of their future and how they can live well. Feeling trapped in pain, like I can't get out, and that pain is a burden to other people. Not only am I internally harboring that, but I'm afraid that that is leaking out of me, and I'm placing that into other people's lives, which just increases the guilt ×2. It's very common that we see people using and or abusing alcohol or drugs. And sometimes that is related to a diagnosis of or an undiagnosed experience of depression as well. Something that we're learning more and more related to suicide is the impact of anxiety. We didn't really talk a lot about anxiety and symptoms of anxiety as warning signs until probably about the last 10 years. But that is definitely something to pay attention to. And that I put there, behaving recklessly, comes from sort of a couple bullet points down there, that feeling of being impulsive. So I'm agitated, I'm keyed up, and I don't know what to do with that energy. And so I begin to do things I might not normally do to try to understand what's going on inside of me, or to try to increase my self-confidence, which may be something that's taken a hit as a result of what I'm dealing with. Difficulties with sleeping, we could also put up there difficulties with eating. Anger, extreme anger, which doesn't necessarily mean it's explosive, but it's really impactfully intense for the person internally, but can have an external expression to it. Mood swings. And then the last one we already hit on just for a little bit there earlier is that withdrawing and isolating behavior, which we, again, similar to hope, when people are withdrawing and isolating in their pain, which is often an attempt to not want to burden others, what really is happening is they're pulling themselves further away from getting care and access to the resources that they really need. So we have the warning signs. Warning signs are important because that means take action now. Risk factors are a little bit different. Risk factors are things that can be in somebody's environment that doesn't necessarily say that they are about to take their life or that they're even thinking about taking their life. But we do know that the more risk factors you have, the greater your odds that should something in life throw you a major curveball, that suicidal thought might be a response to that. And so I just put 3 major, really important categories that consistently come up for people when they have attempted and or completed. So health, so mental health condition, we mentioned earlier, depression, anxiety, substance use. I've already got something going on that is not well for me, and I'm trying to cope with that the best way I know how, except that it's probably bringing me some negative outcomes. I might have some serious pain, a chronic injury, or some sort of chronic condition. This is where we see our elderly at great risk. And people don't realize that our elderly are actually at the greatest risk for suicide, but it's for this reason. And also access to means. TBI, traumatic brain injury, and again, we mentioned that impulsivity and anger. So from a health perspective, we could have some things that might be a part of our world. Historically, and these are extremely important, if I have a history of a suicide attempt in my family, or if I have a history of an attempt myself, my risk goes up considerably. But what's important to note there is that this is not genetic. It's not like if my grandmother attempted suicide twice, my mother is going to die by suicide. It doesn't quite work that way. We don't have a suicide gene. But what we do have are genes for depression and anxiety. So hopefully you're seeing how important and relevant those things are. If I also maybe experienced abuse, if I have some significant trauma or complex trauma in my life, that puts me at risk. And then on the right-hand side, you see some environmental pieces. And these are important because for some of these, we actually can control them a little bit better than some of the others. So access to means would be a good example of that. Do I have a way to take my life? And if I'm someone who's been obsessing about that or spending time researching it, risk goes up even more. Am I experiencing prolonged stress? Do I have negative relationships in my life? For example, the number one reason why we see college students attempt is a breakup. And so relationship problems are a key risk factor. Stressful life events, just transition types of things, adjustment type issues. And then the last one, which is a really important one, is this concept of contagion or imitation, which is just a way of saying that sometimes when we lose someone, or even if we just have an attempt, if we're not careful, we could talk about it, write about it, news stream about it, glorify it, etc., in these ways that sort of suggest this idea that this is a good option for people. And that if you're feeling pain, that this might be a way to resolve that pain. And that, oh, by the way, people might understand your pain better after you're gone when they didn't get it while you were here. So we're really cautious when we have people in the news, we have public figures who attempt or complete. We see across the nation suicide risk going up, and we also see attempts and completions go up. So contagion and imitation is really important to pay attention to.
Thank you, Laura. That last point I think is very important. I was serving as a youth minister in the community of Palo Alto, California in 2009, 2010, about 10 years ago. And there was a cluster of 5 teen suicides over the period of about 8 months. And unfortunately, a few years later in 2013-14, there was a second cluster of teen suicides. And so it was very sad. And I think that there is, a lot to recognize and to that unfortunately, sometimes, if suicide is not handled properly in the media or, in a community, it could activate people, as you pointed out, people that express, hey, this person was memorialized for dying. Maybe I'll be more memorialized, not recognizing that, suicide death is final. So we'll talk a little bit more about memorials later. I do want to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about protective factors and developmental assets. So Laura spent a few minutes talking about some of the risk factors, and protective factors are factors that buffer individuals from suicidal thoughts and behavior. So some of these factors include effective clinical care for mental, physical, and substance use disorders, easy access to a variety of clinical interventions and support for help seeking, faith and community support, support from ongoing medical and mental health care relationships, skills in problem solving, conflict resolution, and nonviolent ways of handling disputes, as well as cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide and support instincts for self-preservation. On that last point, I think it's important to recognize that religion can be very powerful, protective factor. At the same time, it can also be a risk factor if there isn't a clear understanding of the church's teaching on suicide. And I know that was addressed earlier in the fall in one of the NCPD webinars about the church's teaching on suicide and sin. I do want to briefly mention the Search Institute has developed a thing called the Developmental Assets Framework, which contains 40 research-based positive experiences and qualities that influence young people's development, helping them become caring, responsible, and productive adults. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, in their seminal document on youth ministry included the Developmental Assets Framework in the Renewing the Vision, that document that continues to this day to guide youth ministry across the Catholic Church, across the United States. And so Developmental Asset Framework is something that has been adopted by and embraced by the Catholic Church at the highest level here in the US. So we have some time for questions, although I am not seeing any questions thus far. And so we will have some more time for questions. So we're going to continue on, but really encourage you, if there's anything that we have said that you are unsure about, or if there's any beliefs that you may have heard along the way and you would like to know about, please let us know. You definitely have two experts, although I don't know if I'm an expert, but I know Laura definitely is in this field. So please let us know. So we're going to spend a little bit now time talking about intervention. So we talked about prevention, right, which is working to try to prevent suicide. And, as Laura said, sadly, we'll never be able to get rid of suicide. Suicide is as old as humans, but at the same time, we can do a lot to work to minimize those risk factors. Another key area is intervention, or getting support for people that are suicidal or that have attempted. So go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, okay. So I think a good place to start with this is this idea that most people tell us. And that's a tough one, because if you have lost someone to suicide, you know what that feels like, to have that moment of hindsight and to be questioning and to be actually reading the statement and asking yourself if you in fact think that's actually true. And honestly, that's our guilt talking, because it is true. It's just whether or not we see the signs. And I think, tonight is a great example. You will see the signs now more than ever because you've attended this and because this is something maybe that you're passionate about. And I want to also say that we're never responsible for anybody's death, never. But when you know more information, you have more compassion, more empathy, and more knowledge to share, which again is where we're at tonight. So all suicidal ideation behavior should be taken seriously. And for some people, that's a bit of a tricky statement as well, because we'll often hear people say, well, this person's just trying to get attention, or this person doesn't really mean that they want to take their life. They're just using the wrong language. And actually, more often than not, that's not true. But also, my perspective on that is, if someone's trying to get attention through means that communicate they're suicidal, I'm going to give them that attention, because something is going on that needs support, irregardless. And so it's actually really an irrelevant statement to make a decision about whether you reach out to somebody or not, simply because you're trying to decide if you think they really, air quotes, mean it. We take all behavior seriously because we just know how often that plays out in a sad way. Also, I think it's important to know that people who are suicidal don't actually want to die. And we know that from people who have attempted, and the research that goes with some of those conversations with those folks. They don't really want to leave their time on this earth. They just can't imagine going on the way they currently are. They just want that pain to go away. And when you're suicidal, you're kind of living life like this. You have blinders on. You don't see the rest of your periphery. You don't see the resources. You don't see the help. You don't see the hope. And it's very easy to assume that option B is the only option that's left on the table. But that doesn't mean A, C through Z don't actually still exist. You just don't see them. And that's an important statement, because what that does is it gives us hope that we can intervene. That there are moments where we can say and reach out to people, helpful things and reach out to people and get to them before they attempt. So here we go, factually speaking, prior to a suicide, 90% of people demonstrate clear warning signs, and 80% of people actually tell someone, either verbally or non-verbally. So the question is, can you have the confidence, the willingness to reach out to someone, no matter what your perception is of their behavior, just simply to ask the question, are you okay? And I really don't think that that's a rocket science question, but what makes it hard is that the topic and the pain are scary, uncomfortable, and sometimes produce some confusion for us. But the question is very clear. It's very direct. And also what we know is that most people who are suicidal are walking around hoping that somebody will ask them that question. And you can imagine what that might feel like if you're already in this stuck place and you're desperately hoping that someone will notice and open up that conversation for you because you can't fathom doing it yourself. And they don't. Just continues to promote further isolation and pain. But the most common response is silence when we do ask that question. And so going back to Chris's slides earlier, this is why it's so important for us, I say us collectively with the universe, to be aware of the signs and symptoms and to learn how to reach out. So to that end, we would probably not do a good presentation if we didn't give you some pointers on that. Be persistent. A no does not mean that that person still doesn't need help. There are some gatekeeper trainings actually that don't even address that, but there are some that do. And I think that's an important distinction, that if you muster up the courage to ask that question and someone says, no, I'm not suicidal, that does not mean we just go, okay, well, we go on our merry way now. There are next steps to that as well. And being persistent and consistent can be very helpful, because remember, it's not like necessarily the first time we ask people if they're suicidal, they're 100% going to say, yes, I am. And I need all of the help that you can give me. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it does, but not always. Sometimes people need to get that question over and over before they believe that the person who's actually asking it means what they're asking and they can trust them. Follow up, ask again, be a consistent voice in their life. And empathy is a really key piece here when we talk about reaching out to people. And acknowledge it's hard to bring up. You can literally say, I know that this is complicated. I know this is uncomfortable. I'm not sure how to ask, but I'm still going to ask you. I know this is hard to talk about. Some transparency there can go a long way. Being direct. For some of you on this in this presentation tonight, you're very uncomfortable using the word suicide. In fact, you have maybe never, I don't know, said the word suicide. Tonight would be a good night to practice that, or to use the words killing yourself or ending your life, because we like to soften that language. And for someone who's in pain, they don't have time for softened language. They need direct, clear conversations because they're pretty fatigued, and that's about all they can do. And reminding them that you care and you want to help, and again, to follow up with that is really important. So if you say I can help you, be ready to point out how you can do that. And then we all know we have limits, right? Unless you're in a position to treat people who are suicidal, please, I beg you not to pretend that you can. We do know that can cause more harm. I've seen that actually happen. So know your limits. And as people who serve people, who work in the church, who are encountering all kinds of people, I think it's a really great to-do list item, if you don't have it on your list now, to know the resources in your area, to know specific people who are licensed to be able to do those assessments, and to be the channel that you can walk with that person to those resources. But it's often helpful to have those at your fingertips, not at the moment when you need to try to go find them. We also know that treatment works consistently when people get into support, whatever that looks like, because treatment is a pretty broad statement here. And I want to be also clear in saying that if you have suicidal thoughts, we don't rush you off to a hospital and lock you in it. It's not how it works. It might, but more often than not, that's not how it works. But when we get you to whatever support you need, we do know things start to change. And again, there's that hope that we have to have for people when they've lost it themselves. Hopelessness, I mentioned, the strongest contributing factor to suicidal thought. So that's a lot of what we do in crisis intervention and crisis response. And when we're offering support, we're bringing that hope back to the table. We're not creating hope for people, we're helping them to restore and create their own. And then lastly, because I'm a counselor, I think it's helpful to sort of put out there what somebody might experience when they're connected with a counselor. And so just real briefly here, some of the things that we do, we create plans. We try to understand where those thoughts are coming from. What are they connected to? What are those risk factors? What were the warning signs? How do we plan for those again? Because while some people may only experience suicidal thoughts once in their life, that's not the case for everyone. Someone may have them at age 18 and not again until age 34. And learning your style and learning how your mental health responds to things becomes really important. And then having coping strategies to be able to deal with life stressors is something that we spend a lot of time on.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. There was a question that came in about concern that bringing up the concept of suicide could put the idea in someone's head where it wasn't one. Would you like to field that question?
Whoever asked that question, thank you for asking that question. That is one of the biggest myths out there. Asking directly about suicide does not put the idea in somebody's head. It just doesn't work that way. You're not going to push somebody over the edge. You're not going to, it's not like people are walking around not sure what they're thinking and feeling and suddenly go, oh, you brought up suicide? Oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. It just doesn't work like that. So please don't believe that myth. Now, what does impact things is if you're clear with your words, you're actually saying killing, dying, suicide, that does impact things, as does your empathy behind asking those questions. Those are major difference makers. But the fact that you bring it up and ask is not going to push someone to take that action. And in fact, when we study people again who have attempted but not completed, that's what they consistently tell us. I just needed somebody to open the door for me so that I could begin to talk about the most difficult part of my life.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And we'll definitely have some more time for Q&A a little bit later on in the session. So we're going to move into kind of our last part, which is on postvention. And this is what to do after a suicide, either a suicide attempt or a suicide completion.
So I just wanted to clarify what we mean by survivors, because there's two definitions for that. And postvention is a lot about surviving and trying to understand what survival now means and what connection means. So when we talk about suicide survivors, we're referencing possibly two types of people. We're talking about the person who attempted but did not complete, or we could be talking about the people who are left behind to make sense of what happened because someone did complete. And they're left to try to grieve their way, through that process. So we have two types of suicide survivors. And so it's, I think, always important to make a differentiation between those two. We also know that each person who dies by suicide leaves behind 6 or more survivors. And so then in that sense, we're talking about the people who were their loved ones close to them, who may or may not have known what was going on, may or may not have recognized those signs and symptoms. And we also know that people who are coping with a loss need more support than normal, but statistically speaking, they actually get less. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, there are people who will go to their own grave denying that a loss in their life was a suicide, when in fact it truly was. This is part of what I was talking about earlier when I said our statistics are underreported. Often, suicide is covered with an accident, a car accident, or it just isn't reported because people are not comfortable doing that, or that stigma, that self-stigma is a part of that. And so sometimes we're just not there. We're not willing to talk about it, and we're not willing to believe that that was reality. And that's okay. People will come to that reality in their own time. People often feel serious shame, serious embarrassment, and often a lot of anger. And they don't know how to massage those emotions out in a way that they can then have a conversation with somebody and be open and honest and authentic about what's going on for them. Those things just feel too intense. And so there isn't that transparency. There isn't a desire yet or an ability yet to be able to share on that deeper level. And then also we know people don't get support because Well, you heard it earlier, silence is a thing. People don't know how to offer help. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're afraid that they're going to be perceived as judgmental or whatever it may be. And so people don't say anything at all. So here, this is an important, I think, note that we have people who don't say anything when someone says that they're contemplating suicide or they're having suicidal thoughts. And we have people who don't know what to say when someone actually attempts or completes. So we've got some serious prevention work to do there. I mentioned that when you're left to unravel a death by suicide, that's not easy. And when we look at grief as a human universal phenomenon, and because it is, everybody experiences grief about something at some point in their life. When we look at suicide in the box of grief, that tends to be the most complex type of grief that anybody can experience because there's so many layers involved there. And as I mentioned earlier, suicide is very complex. It's just not that simple of an experience or of a behavior. And so a lot of people are left wondering and questioning and don't get the answers they're looking for about their loved one and what might have been going on in their head and in their heart. And unless that person is able to be there to tell them directly, it will never feel like enough. It will never feel like the clarity is there. Reminders and memories trigger painful feelings years and years later, even after the initial grieving process and bereavement process has subsided. And grief and guilt are really good friends. And so sometimes those are both playing out for someone. And people are left thinking, well, what could I have done to prevent this? Where did I miss a sign? And where did I go wrong? And that's a really heavy thing to carry around on your heart. So we just put up here some common emotions in addition to grief. These are the ones that we see the most. And I would argue that in that grieving process, people bounce around with these emotions. Some of them attach to each other, some of them lead to other emotions. But I just wanted us to see again that there's a lot of complexity to how we heal.
Great, thank you, Laura. So I'm going to talk a little bit about best practices in memorials. So as I mentioned a little earlier in the webinar, that suicide contagion is a real concern. And in cases of suicide, communities must consider how to appropriately memorialize a young person who has died by suicide without risking suicide contagion among other young people who may themselves be at risk. So the goal of a community should be to balance the young person's need to grieve with the goal of limiting the risk of inadvertently glamorizing the death. Sadly, a few years back, there was the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, and unfortunately, the producers of that chose not to listen to the advice. Actually, Netflix is located, in my area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and there were some real challenges. Health, some people in the mental health field provided input and suggestions on how the show should or should not handle suicide. And unfortunately, a lot of those recommendations were not taken. And sadly, I was reading a research study the other day that showed that there were increases of suicide directly related to young people watching the series. So I wanted to mention that there are some creative ideas that you can do in looking at supporting and honoring somebody, who may have died by suicide. There's going to be a resource that I'm going to mention towards the end in the next couple of slides about that further goes into this. But some creative ideas include holding a day of community service or creating a community service program in honor of the deceased, putting together a team to participate in awareness or fundraising event sponsored by one of the national mental health or suicide prevention organizations, sponsoring a mental health awareness day, purchasing books on mental health for community organization or local library, volunteering at a community crisis hotline, raising funds to help the family defray the funeral expenses, making a book available for several weeks in which students can write messages and share memories of the deceased or offer condolences. So I think it's important, to recognize that we need to be very careful about how we choose to memorialize those young people that have died by suicide. And so I will again be talking about more of in a few minutes. So we're going to move into our final part of our webinar before taking some Q&A, and we've gotten some great questions that have come in, so thank you very much. So here, this section is how you can help. So there are some resources. There are 4 that are listed here. I already talked about QPR, question, persuade, refer. I strongly encourage everyone on this webinar that's watching to reach out and learn. You can actually take QPR online. I know that a lot of mental health or behavioral health departments in counties and cities across the country offer QPR for free. So I encourage you to learn more about that. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP, has some great resources. And then know the signs of suicide, suicideispreventable.org. This is actually an effort of my home state in California through Prop 63, which is the millionaire's tax. Anyone making over $1 million in California is taxed, and that money goes into supporting mental health and behavioral health efforts. And so they have this wonderful campaign, Know the Signs of Suicide, very helpful in terms of recognizing signs of suicide. A lot of what Laura talked about, but definitely has some additional things as well. And then finally, the toolkit for mental health promotion and suicide prevention is, which is listed there, shown there in the right corner. It was developed by the HERD Alliance, which is actually based in Palo Alto. And I got quite engaged with the Alliance as the suicide deaths occurred, mentioned earlier, about 10 years ago. So these are some great resources, and Laura's going to talk about some additional ones specifically for crisis response.
Yeah, so you see the American Foundation is on here twice because AFSP is great from the education realm of things, but they're also very active in crisis response in the United States and on the front end of helping to develop those things. And one of them, which isn't on here because we're not ready for it yet, but will soon be the 988 call line that you'll see in 2022 that will be actually replacing the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That was a big decision our government made in the past year. And AFSP is a very strong advocate for suicide prevention work and materials, but also crisis. The crisis text line, which you might be familiar with, is similar to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in that it is a national number, but it routes locally to your area. I should say that not every city has a local number. So some numbers, some folks, when they call the national line, they will stay with trained responders on that national line. But the goal with both of these is that if you have someone who's in crisis or worried about somebody else who's in crisis, the lines are good for both of those. They want to connect you to the resources that are nearby. And so they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that they understand where you're coming from and where you're at, so that they're giving you the most helpful, immediate information and access to care that they can. Obviously, the crisis text line is a crisis line. The suicide prevention lifeline is a phone line, but there are sub lines within both of those. So for example, our veterans, there is a specific veterans line for suicide prevention, et cetera. So I would encourage you to, if this is not something you have in your phone or not something that you have, again, readily available in your toolkit, you can call any of these 2 numbers with any question, no matter how big or small your crisis is, and they will be able to point you in the right direction. And at the very least, 911 is the way to go. We have come a long way with our 911 responders and with folks who work with 911 to know how to fast track the best responses to people who may be witnessing someone who's attempting, or to someone who was brave enough to call to say, I don't believe I'm safe and I need help now. So please don't hesitate to use that as well.
Great, thank you.
And then we thought it would be good to wrap up with a bit of a call to action here. You know, we've kind of inserted a few ideas along the way, but to pull this to a close, many of you are probably thinking, okay, I don't know someone necessarily who is suicidal right now, but I feel a sense of urgency to respond to this societal problem. And to that I say, good, thank you, join the team with the rest of us, because there are things that you can do to support and to be an advocate for people who may be dealing with this, even if you're not directly impacted by somebody. The first thing is to challenge the myths. And we're not going to have time tonight to go through those myths, but you will find those on sites like AFSP, the American Association for Suicidology, etc. Because prevention is about demystifying those myths. And so what you can do is to learn them yourself, as in to learn how to debunk those myths. And then when you hear people speaking in ways that are not accurate, to be able to have a voice yourself to say, I'm not sure that's true. Let me point you to a resource that might help, so that we're not spreading those myths any more than they need, excuse me, to be spread. Number two is to educate yourself, just like you're doing right now. As Chris mentioned, there's a lot of great ways to learn. And there are a lot of great programs depending on your level of interest, if you have a particular mental health license, et cetera. I mean, we have a lot of great resources and opportunities. Talk openly about mental health. The stigma is real. And the more that we can break that down, the more that we increase hope, the more we increase help-seeking behaviors. And to do that right, to be cautious of your language. Our opening prayer says it so well. We don't refer to people as victims of their illnesses. And so being able to separate a symptom from someone's identity and their soul, really important. But also to be able to say accurately, like, what things mean in our mental and emotional health, and to not use language that is degrading, but also just not right, not accurate. And number five, if somebody fell down on the sidewalk and they broke their leg, we wouldn't just look at them and say, that looks like an awful wound. I really hope that you get that sutured up. Good luck and Godspeed. We just wouldn't do that. And so I guess we often have to ask ourselves, why do we do that when it comes to mental and emotional health? Why do we have this attitude to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on? Or don't even tell me you broke your leg in the first place. And so encouraging that equality is important. Showing compassion, that's that empathetic spirit. I think our church is good at pushing that notion onto us as Christians, to pull that out and to use that as a strength with people. Let the media know when they're stigmatizing. When we lost Anthony Bourdain, when we lost Kate Spade, you better believe I was writing CNN to say, you're doing it wrong, because they did. And we saw increases, and we all braced ourselves for that. So don't be afraid to write, to talk, to make a phone call, to say, this is not the positive narrative that we're trying to promote. So we talked about memorializing earlier, but in addition to memorializing, just how you talk about a death, how you write about it, how the news portrays it. There are do's and don'ts that we know will increase harm, that will increase contagion, as we talked about earlier. And if you're curious about that, AFSP.org has great handouts and tip sheets for that. And then lastly, not harboring your own self-stigma. I recognize whenever we do a presentation on suicide prevention, there's always someone in my audience that is currently struggling, always, or has a history of attempts themselves, or knows someone who's currently struggling. At this point, in any workshop, we could ask for a show of hands for who is affected, and every hand will go up. So I want to ask you to be compassionate to yourself, and to be careful that you're not getting lost in your own pain and harboring self-stigma and not getting the resources and the care that you need. Hope exists. We've heard us say today, access to care is important, but resources really do exist and treatment works. And so if you yourself are struggling, or you know somebody else, please don't see it as a sign of weakness to reach out. People do care. People are ready to help.
Awesome, thank you. So we have about 6 minutes before we end our webinar, and we have 4 questions. So if it's okay with you, Laura, I'd like to have you field 2 of them, and I'll do 2, and we can add to each other as needed. So one of the questions came in was, do you have any suggestions for, in a school counseling situation, when referring out for services for an underage student where parents won't sign consent to enter community treatment and a student has suicidal ideation? Do you have any suggestions or thoughts on what to do in that type of situation?
Yep, I'm rereading that question to make sure I got it all right there. Yeah. So we're talking about a minor, so a student who's under 18. Parents won't sign consent to enter community treatment. So a couple of things jump to mind immediately. Different states have different rules about minors seeking support when parents are not supportive. So here in the state of Ohio, if you are 15 to 17 years of age, you actually can seek treatment without your parents' consent. And that's because we know that these situations exist, but every state is different. So it's worth looking at that. But in general, just a couple of quick pieces with that. And I think the question went away for me to reference there.
Yep. Sorry,
But
I clicked it.
that's okay. That's okay. Yeah. It comes down to parent education. I mean, it's education for all of us. That's what we've been saying today. If people are refusing to get people the help they need, that is an issue of misinformation or an issue of stigma. So I think that kind of speaks to some of what we're saying tonight.
Great, thank you. I'm going to tackle two of the questions kind of at the same time. They're similar. One of the questions is, what's the best way to educate a community, in this case a parish, that prevention is everyone's business? And then in addition to that, what do you think is the role of parish-based youth ministry? I'm thinking this is how parishes can create belonging and community for our youth. So I am currently teaching at a high school setting right now, Catholic High School, Lasallian Brothers in the Diocese of Oakland. But my most recent job prior to my current position was working as a youth ministry coordinator at a 5,000 family parish in San Jose for about 3.5 years. And one of the things that I, as the youth minister, ran confirmation and a parish youth ministry group or youth group, one of the things was, and I think hit the nail on the head there, is that's creating a sense of belonging and community, right? And that's one of the key components of a protective factor, is having somebody that feels like they have a purpose, right? That they have, that they belong and they can contribute. So I would really encourage you to take a look at, I referenced it earlier, the 40 Developmental Assets has some great, its research base has some great ideas for how communities and congregations, in fact, they are doing a study right now in looking at developmental relationships, which is the latest research out of Search Institute, and how faith-based organizations can work to support relationship building. So I think that there is definitely a role of parish-based youth ministry. When I was working as a youth minister, as I mentioned, in Palo Alto about 10 years ago, there was a cluster of teen suicides, and they was really working with the young people in that parish and that community to help them through some of the challenges. In addition, somewhat similar question, what is the best way to educate a community, in this case a parish, that prevention is everyone's business? And I think it's important to recognize, as we heard earlier, that suicide is everyone's business, and recognizing that church is truly pro-life. I think sometimes that term becomes politicized, where we only focus, or not, shouldn't say only, but where we tend to focus on the beginning and end of life. And while absolutely that's important, I also think we need to be looking at the middle of life, right? Or even towards the beginning with our young people. And so I would say it's a pro-life, issue, is that we are, as a Catholic Church, we respect and honor the dignity of the human person, and really, feel that as a community we can work together. So I don't know, Laura, if you have any additional comments on that before we go to our last question.
I think that's great. And, the other thing I would say is it's education, and it's advocacy, and it's outreach, and creating an environment where people feel comfortable coming forward to have these tough conversations. Not everybody is suicidal, but a lot of people just don't know how to talk about it. So creating an atmosphere that says tough stuff is welcome here, and bringing in speakers who are knowledgeable, who are experts on the topic, doing advocacy outreach events to make that more tangible for people. Having literature and things that people can grab, whether they're seen or not seen grabbing it. There's a fine line there between playing into stigma and breaking it. But I do think it is about creating a welcoming environment that says we can come together around this topic.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to have you field the last question before we conclude today. And that is, what one or two big pieces of advice would you give parents of young children who are seeking to raise emotionally healthy children who would not consider suicide as an option when life is painful?
Yeah. Okay. Boy, Lisa, I'm glad you're a parent. This is a great question to ask. And I think, we could start with saying, keep the lines of communication open. Okay. We know that. But it's also about, again, role modeling stigma or destigmatization, I'll say. As a parent, using accurate language to talk about mental and emotional health conditions. I often say we all have mental health. We don't all have mental health disorders. And so there's always common ground there to talk about what we're thinking and what we're feeling. And so it's giving kids language, it's giving them space, it's letting them know that anything that's tough that they bring to the table is welcome there. But it's also, to go back to our earlier point, it's about hope. And as often as you can, saying there is nothing that is too big, too tricky, too ugly, too painful that we cannot figure out together. And promoting that idea that as a parent, you're on a team with your kids. And a lot of times they're going to drive the team. A lot of times you're going to drive the team. But irregardless, that on that team, anything is welcome. And again, that really sends a powerful message that, one, I can talk to you if something would ever come up. But two, I got mental health. I don't have to have a disorder to have that conversation. I just want to live well. And so promoting that attitude is really important.
Yeah, very much so. And I think sometimes, we hear mental health as in, a negative sense. And, the way I look at it is that we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health, or we all have, social health. And so it's on that continuum, and it's from mentally well to mentally ill. And so I think it's, recognition, where are people on that spectrum? Well, that is, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Laura. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Have this opportunity to share with you. The webinar series, our fall webinar series, comes to a conclusion with this webinar. However, not to fear, as we will pick up again in January, where we will continue with the second Monday of the month at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And our next session will be on Monday, January 11th. Which will focus on artificial intelligence and suicide. There's actually quite a lot of work that's being done. An organization that offers a program called Sister Hope, which is providing an opportunity for artificial intelligence to be able to, respond and support suicide prevention and intervention efforts. So we hope that you can join us. And in the meantime, hope everyone has a wonderful and safe Advent, the rest of your Advent and Christmas season. And we look forward to seeing you in 2021. So God bless. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Al. Appreciate it. Great job.
Okay, are we done, or are you still live?
I ended the recording. We're still going. I don't know how to stop it without just totally ending. So I thought I'd at least say come on and say goodbye and thanks.
Okay.
That sounded really good. Thanks. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you both. It's been great to meet you and to work with you.
Yeah, no, it was really impressive. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for leading us through that.
Yeah,
All right.
All right,
Bye-bye.